Yes. I don't think we can take a closed position with regard to foreign investment. I mean, even when we were in the government, we were drawing up liberal foreign investment laws. The contradiction is what it always has remained, and that is how to make compatible economic integration, on which we cannot turn our backs on the world market, with sovereignty. Because we're sufficiently old-fashioned to believe in sovereignty, even though many of our friends on the right, in the name of the greater need to integrate into the world market and tear down the barriers, are throwing sovereignty out the banner and telling the IMF and the World Bank, you run our monetary and our fiscal policies. We can't be absolutist about sovereignty either. I think the sovereignty in the terms that we have known it over the last 30 or 40 decades is out. The boundaries of sovereignty are receding. But maybe we just have to be able to learn to give in on the formalities in order to better preserve the substance of sovereignty, to preserve the essence of self-determination. And in that context, foreign investment can and should be welcomed. We have learned enough of the way capital works that sometimes it's worse to be exploited by national capital than it is by foreign capital. Don't take sovereignty to that extreme. And indeed, if we can foresee equitable forms of capital to come in, and of course they're going to demand repatriation of their profits, but where it should not take place at the price of human dignity, at the price of human exploitation. We know there's a tension there, but it can be resolved. We have to find a formula. I don't see any other alternative. Yes?
Is there a form of investment that you prefer? I mean, as far as joint ventures or licensing arrangements for foreign capital?
Everything is being rethought now. I mean, not that there's a huge line of private investors that are there waiting to invest in Central America. That's not it. But you do have something very important taking place now and in an accelerated form, and that is the sub-regional integration of markets. There's a lot of talk about the new common market with Mexico. And the Central American presidents are going to be meeting with the Mexican president to see about Central American integration into the greater economic links with Mexico. And 2 weeks ago, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Brazil signed a new agreement that is practically cutting down to a minimum their commercial and trade barriers. These two are part of the new political and economic order. And I think they have to be supported. I mean, we're not against the concept of integration per se. I mean, that's being dictated by the velocity and the complexity of the world economy. It's a technological and a financial necessity. What we have to learn how to do is to fight for the best terms of integration. And maybe in a sub-regional way, we can define just what codes would be better. And not simply because 5 brains or 5 countries think better than one, but certainly 5 have a better more collective bargaining power than simply one. Because if the United States takes us on a one-to-one basis, we're finished. Hence, the answer just may be in greater regional integration. I don't think that either on a political or an economic basis there is a possibility for national answers anymore. Certainly not in Central America, but perhaps not in the rest of the Third World. And that indeed, if we are going to defend our sovereignty, politically and economically, it's going to have to take on in the form of a collective effort. And in a collective way, then go in and bargain with the United States. And not only with the United States, but with the new European bloc and with the Japanese. Again, maybe it's too much to aspire to be economically independent. But what we can do is to reduce the levels of our dependence by diversifying the sources of our trade, of our markets, of our sources of technology. And here governments, even if they're right-wingish, have to begin thinking along those lines and are thinking along those lines. And even though they might be just as dedicated to freedom of enterprise, the free market and deregulation and privatization, they still have got their contradictions with the United States. You think the Mexicans are going to let the common market agreement or the free trade agreement entail that the American oil companies take over Mexican petroleum? That's hard. It's in their constitution. And there's a huge debate on it. But we have to watch this very closely, because in other areas, the Mexicans are willing to say, take it, it's yours. And take some of our migrants and our tomatoes, they're yours. The right is thinking faster than we are. There's a good article in this Business Week, the issue of this week on this subject. It's interesting. Yes?
On the other hand, you have companies like Green Giant, for example, which employed I don't know how many workers in California.
Huh?
Green Giant, the canned vegetables.
A Jolly Giant.
Right. And they laid off all their employees. They were paying $7 an hour, because now they can open a plant in Mexico and pay 15 cents an hour, or however much they pay. And this is what you're going to see too, you see. So I don't see, this is fine and dandy, but if you stretch it too far.
No, I'm not giving it my seal of approval. I'm just saying that we have to take it seriously. And we have to look at it, we have to study, and so do the American people. That's what this article in Business Week just talks of the massive moving of industries and of capital to the other side of the border, where wages happen to be 1/14 of what they are in this country. What does that do? How does the working class in this country feel about that? So you're all part of this debate the same way we are. And that's why these type of dialogues have to take place. Because our alternatives has to be a broad-based, multinational, popular alternative.
Is there a possibility that you might see in Central American countries of a debtors cartel forming to balance off the power of the IMF and the World Bank?
Not on a Central American level. There have been initiatives, and that was a big failure of the 1980s in terms of Latin America. The debtors cartel never got off the ground. The tendency was for bilateral negotiations. Everybody was trying to save their own skin. And the results of that have been disappointing. But maybe it has to be looked at again. Precisely one of the aspects of integration is being able to look once more collectively at the debt question. I don't think that on a Central American basis we're strong enough to tell the banks to stick it. Nor are we sufficiently politically coherent, but we just may be moving in that direction. And it's not a question of whether you're going to pay your debts or not. It's now a question on what terms you're going to pay them. We've got to be realistic about that too. If not, you're automatically cut off from new sources of funding. And particularly in the case of the Central Americans, the component of foreign of foreign assistance and of private and especially governmental, foreign governmental lending is very high. And now because you've got these cross-conditionality schemes, the IMF is not going to give you 1 cent unless you've made an arrangement with your commercial debtors, and vice versa. I mean, you just, unless we go off and live on another planet somewhere, it's not, we don't have any alternative but to deal with them. But again, the more collective, the better.
Could you comment a little bit about the internal political situation in Nicaragua and the struggle that seems to be ensuing over some of the fundamental structural changes of the revolution, for example, the land reform and the state-run enterprises and that sort of thing, and will those changes be able to be successfully protected through this 6-year period?
I think the Nicaraguan Revolution, which is not over, is going to have to be evaluated not so much on the basis of the elections, but whether the social, political, organizational, and mental transformations that took place over the last 10 years proved to be irreversible or not. We have a pretty good hunch they will. Indeed, it wouldn't have made sense to go to elections if they hadn't. There wouldn't have been a revolution, because revolution does not equate the government being in office. Revolution means that people have required a sense of their own power, of their own dignity, of their own capacity to organize, and of their own capacity to demand their legal rights. And what's more, those rights are in the Constitution. Legality is on the side of the people. Still, a right-wing government was elected, and it has a right-wing program. And it's going to try to implement that program. But it's going to run up against vested interests in society, vested revolutionary interests, which have a perfect legal standing, which have a constitutional protection. And the trouble is that when the government in Nicaragua can't seem to implement its program and workers go on strike, then they accuse us, the Sandinistas, of trying to overthrow the government. But when that happens in another country, it's called democracy. And this is what democracy is all about. Since when do party platforms and do government programs get automatically translated into policy? No. They go into the shove and push. And this is what happened. You will see that it's taking place on an educational level, on the question on land questions, employment policies, fiscal policies, credit policies, every aspect of politics. And in each one of those, there's going to be a tug. There's going to be a clash. First of all, it's going to be a peaceful clash. And secondly, the government is not going to be able to get everything it wants. And we are not going to be able to get, as an opposition, everything that we want. And there's going to be some necessary give and take. There's going to be some reversals there. But we have to remember that this government was born out. Mrs. Chamorro was a product of the revolution. This government was elected on account of a constitution that was drawn up by the revolution, on account of rules of the game that were set up by the revolution, that were defended, upheld, and protected by the Sandinistas. And we too have to adhere to those rules of the game, because it's under those same rules of the game that we intend to come back in the 1996 elections. So we too have a responsibility to behave civically. and to resist any temptation to pick up a gun. This is what the political transformation is all about. And thanks to the revolution, you no longer have an army there that is going to crush workers when they demand their rights. And nor is it going to be an army that moves against the government that it doesn't like. It's there to uphold a constitutional order. Even though Nicaragua is the only country in the world with a right-wing government and a left-wing army.
Do you think one of the less fortunate lessons of the last decade was the effectiveness of so-called low-intensity conflict? And it seems like that technique is going to be used repeatedly if deemed appropriate by the U.S. Any comment on that?
It could be. I think we have to look at the theories of low-intensity conflict all over again. You could argue that they were effective in Nicaragua. They just wore us down, wore the people down, steadily. Again, we made the mistake of assuming that there was an infinite capacity of people to withstand sacrifice and pain. So in the evaluations that we now do, the question we ask ourselves is not why did the Chamorro coalition manage to get 56% of the vote. The question we're now asking, how did we manage to get 41% of the vote? In the light of those tremendous constraints, in the light of that pressure, in the light of that pain. And part of the conclusion you come to is that means that 41% of the Nicaraguan electorate was nothing less than heroic, willing to endure new pain. Because they were clear, Sandinistas and people that voted for UNO, was that if the FSLN got reelected, the embargo was going to continue, the Contras were going to continue attacking, and nothing was really ever going to get better. And yet they continued, and they voted for the FSLN, which is an indication of a high level of consciousness. But not everyone's a hero. And you have to respect the rights of those that don't want to be heroes. And in that sense, that type of campaign, that type of warfare can work. Not to mention the dirty tricks that were waged during the campaign. The use of the American money, the manipulations, the attacks that took place that intimidated people. On the other hand, if the objective of the United States and of its low-intensity warfare was to eliminate the revolutionary option in Central America, to eliminate and to crush the Sandinistas, which is what Reagan vowed to do, they failed. We are now and continue to be the strongest, most effective, most coherent, organized political force in Nicaragua. The government doesn't even have a political party of its own. It's 21 parties that are feuding among themselves all the time. So we survived. And in historical terms, we won.
One more question, I think.
Please.
What do you think will be the undoing of the Chamorro government? Will it be the factionalism? Or maybe in the opposite direction? What is the left wing going to do to ensure its election remains?
It's a hard question. A lot of us don't even want to think of going back to government for a while. But the main thing we have to look at right now is whether we're going to allow this government to collapse or not. It's not whether we're going to overthrow it. 2 weeks ago, there was a concertación, a social pact agreement. The government indeed agreed to modify its economic program in order that it could get some consensual support from the unions. And the Frente came out in support of that. Had we refused to do that, had the unions refused to do that, it's difficult to conceive that the government could have survived. Yet there was a sense of responsibility not to allow a collapse, because the collapse means political turmoil. Collapse might mean a resurgence of violence, and then everything we've been fighting for could just come tumbling to the ground. And it was a hard decision, to give some minimal support to this government, which we feel responsible for. Yet, on the other hand, you don't want to help it too much, because you have to think of the 1996 elections. But it's a real dilemma. We had to help it because the government is now engaged in a series of foreign missions here in the States and in Europe right now, and even to Japan, to try to procure extraordinary financial assistance. And the principal card that they're taking to the governments is to say, look, we have a national consensus here. We have the backing of the FSLN. This is a national request. And frankly, we hope that they're able to get those funds. Again, let's hope they don't get too much in order not to create a paradise in Nicaragua, and then we're in trouble again. But it's a dilemma. We want political stability. We want economic stability. More important than that, we want the state of economic agony of our people to end. And we've got to put that above our own party interest.